Tales from the Break Room is a viewer submission podcast, and we pay 5 cents per word for stories sent to eriecast.com/submit, if we end up featuring it on the show, and PayPal only. While you're at it, go to eriecast.com to hear more of my scary narrations and enjoy other terrifying podcasts.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Sure, I handle milk every day here. Gotta fill up those viscera lattes with something before adding the organ syrup, am I right? But after hearing a certain story recently about a dairy farm, I'm content with never stepping foot at the place we get our milk. Because according to an eyewitness, something out there is tearing apart cattle and scared away the night security for good. I've got this story to share with you and more on my break, which starts now. Enjoy. These are Tales from the Break Room. Cab Driver of Death, from William P. 85. This story was told to me by my Grandpa Norbert. Grandpa Norbert loved horror movies and all things spooky. He liked to tell my cousins and me all kinds of creepy stories about La Llorona and the Whistling Man to scare us before bed. I remember late one night at my grandpa's big home. My cousins and I were still awake because there was a thunderstorm raging outside. We were teenagers at the time, so we were talking about our favorite TV show, Goosebumps. I confessed the show gave me nightmares sometimes. My grandpa seemed to have overheard our conversation. He knocked on the bedroom door, walked inside, and asked us, "Do you kids want to hear a really scary story? I have to warn you, this one's disturbing." Excitedly, we all said, "Yeah, Grandpa, we love your stories." "All right then, remember, I did warn you," he cautioned. From this point on, I'll tell the story from my grandpa's perspective. This story is a bit different from the other ones I've told you. It took place in 1997 in a city called Maracay, Venezuela. The center of this city was quite busy at night. In contrast to the yellow cabs that you have probably seen in American movies and TV, most cabs around here are white. Many people in the city preferred to travel by cab, since they were more accessible and comfortable compared to buses. As the months went by, many people avoided riding alone in these cabs at night. The reason was that a rather disturbing story had emerged in the city about nighttime cab drivers. One of these drivers used to drive along the main avenue in the city looking for a passenger or his next victim. This is the story of one of my old co-workers. Her name was Liz. Liz was the secretary in the office where I worked, and she experienced one of the worst nights of her life while riding in one of these cabs. At the time, she was attending a night course that her company paid for a few blocks from her office. Her classes were until 9 p.m. She didn't like to take a bus home because the closest bus stop was very far away from her home, and she had to walk several blocks by herself. For that reason, when she was out late, she preferred to take a cab on the avenue. One night, in the middle of a long chat with her classmates, she was later than usual. She said to them, "Oh, look at the time. Sorry, girls, but I have to go now." Liz looked at her watch and hurried across the avenue. She stopped at the corner to wait for a cab while she eyed the closed stores and the few people left on the street. A few cabs passed by with passengers, and this made her feel a little desperate. Then she noticed that on one of the street corners, there was a man staring at her. The woman felt quite nervous, so she began to walk towards the cathedral. For an instant, she turned around and realized that the man had crossed the street and was now following her. As she made her way to the cathedral, a white cab was approaching with its sign on. The cabs around there have a sign that flashes, which the drivers can turn on whenever they're on duty. She noticed him, so she moved closer to the street and reached out her hand in desperation. The cab indeed stopped and lowered his dark, tinted window. "Oh, good evening, sir," she said. "How much does it cost to drive me to my neighborhood?" "Good evening. Give me 50, answered the man with a somewhat fake smile. Liz, without thinking too much, got in and sat in the back. When she looked out the window, she noticed that the man from the street had strangely disappeared. After the scare, she took a deep breath and then perceived a putrid smell in the car, which seemed to have been mixed with an excessive smell of car air freshener. While she was giving her exact address to the driver, they passed by a square. Then the cab driver looked at her in the rearview mirror and made a strange comment. "In the early morning, after I finish making my runs, I park my cab and I walk through this square. I wash my hands in the fountain and sit on the benches. At that time, you can see a show in the roundabouts. Cops and hookers going about their business, homeless people fighting over garbage, and others hiding in the bushes. I enjoy that view. They know that I am their only spectator. By the way, may I make a confession? Every night I drive by with another passenger and I see you alone on that corner where I just picked you up. I have to say I always wanted to take you to your destination." After that comment, Liz felt uncomfortable and did not answer him. Internally, she began to pray in order to get home as soon as possible. Suddenly, the cab driver turned into an unfamiliar street, and she felt even more worried. "Why are you going this way?" she asked. "I know the way. Calm down. I'm the driver here, and tonight I'm also in control of your fate," he said. The smell was becoming unbearable, and Liz looked at her feet. She realized that near her, on the seat next to her, there was a big black suitcase. She looked at it for a while and began to associate it with that bad smell. Meanwhile, the man kept talking to her. "God sent me here to purify the earth," he explained. His voice became more guttural. Liz just hugged her purse tightly. The cab arrived at the woman's home and parked near the entrance. Relieved, she took a breath and gave him the money owed right away. "Here you go, and have a nice evening," she said. "That will not be possible," the man said. He immediately locked all the doors, taking out a gun from his glove compartment. As soon as Liz saw that gun, she began to cry in a panic and stared out the window, wishing for a family member to come out and rescue her. "By the way, if any of your relatives open a door, I'll shoot them. You'd better pray no one comes out here. I'm not going to charge you for the ride. I just need a small favor. There is a black suitcase behind my seat. Open it and pass me the pack of cigarettes that's inside. But before you do that, I will unlock the doors and you will have a choice to make. Run away and leave without paying, or do this small favor for me," he said. Liz agreed, although she didn't understand the favor. With her nerves on edge, she laid the suitcase on the seat and began to pry it open. Her trembling hands prevented her from doing it very quickly. When she discovered what was inside, her face went pale. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Indeed, the foul smell had been coming from there. She felt nauseous and dizzy when she saw its contents. They were not clothes or anything easy to guess. What lay sloppily in that suitcase was a dismembered corpse covered in dried blood. It seemed it was forcefully put into this suitcase and it was starting to decompose. That was my last victim, and also my last passenger. He wanted to leave without doing this small favor for me, and look how he ended up. The cab driver told her with a threatening tone. Liz then grabbed the cigarettes and threw them at the cab driver. She then quickly opened the door and ran out. After turning her back on the situation, she expected the worst. When she reached the door of her home, the cab drove away at full speed. From that night on, the man was never heard from again, and that was how the story of the cab driver of death was born. It was said that a murderer hid behind the facade of a cab driver, a psychopath who had a strange fascination for showing his dismembered victims to lonely, terrified passengers. Another version of the story said that the human remains in that suitcase belonged to the real owner of the cab, who was a victim of a murderer that was a fugitive from justice. My grandpa finished the story by telling us a piece of advice. So when you kids grow up and decide to take a cab and sit in the back, look carefully behind the driver's seat. If you see a big black suitcase, you may have two options that night. Run away and leave without paying, or give the pack of cigarettes to the driver. After hearing that story, my cousins and I felt terrified, of course, but if there was one thing we knew for sure, it was that we would never get in a cab at night ever again. Haunted Old Brothel, Above Restaurant, from April. Whenever I would be home from college for summer, and sometimes Christmas break, I would work at a restaurant downtown that had an abandoned apartment-looking space above the restaurant that used to be a brothel back in the 1800s and 1900s. Back then, downstairs, where the restaurant is now, was the saloon, and the above space was a brothel. Turns out that brothel was shut down when a sheriff had his wife go undercover so she could get information to shut the place down for good. It turns out the brothel would also perform abortions for any of the women who ended up pregnant. The brothel was shut down shortly after, and now the saloon is a barbecue restaurant, while the above brothel is empty. I would hear stories from coworkers who had been there for a while, saying you could hear children laughing upstairs, and whenever the restaurant was really quiet, you could hear a bunch of them running around. It always sounded like tiny feet. I worked the busy nights and never closed, so I never heard anything until a certain week. I was home for the summer, and this time possibly staying instead of going back to school due to some family problems. I was finally scheduled to help close one night, and as we were putting up chairs, my coworker told me to be quiet and listen. It was almost too faint, but gradually it got a little louder. The sound of light footsteps running around could be heard. It never grew too loud, but it did turn into multiple sets of steps. It was so strange hearing it for myself. I always believed it was haunted, but actually hearing it was something else entirely. I wasn't scared at the moment, but I was definitely a bit uneasy. The noise would come and go while we closed up, and we even asked the manager if we could go up there and check it out. There was a key to the upstairs door, but the managers would never let anyone go up there. One night while closing, one of the employees was promoted to manager, and this was his first night closing as the only manager. After the place closed up, we sat and had a drink at the bar. Me, him, and another girl. We then began to hear little feet running around upstairs. With some of our liquid courage, we decided to go up there. The manager grabbed the keys and unlocked the door. As soon as we started to head upstairs, I felt like we shouldn't be there. A feeling of tremendous sadness overwhelmed me. My coworker pulled out her phone and had a recorder app going. She started to ask questions as we walked around, mostly basic ones like, "What is your name? How did you die?" Things like that. I had chills and goosebumps the whole time and really just started feeling uneasy and sad. The whole upstairs looked almost like a doctor's office. Once you walked in, there was a big room with a small hallway that had about 4 doors on each side, which were bedrooms. One room we went into gave me the creeps big time. It was almost like a master bedroom. The room was bigger than the others and had a bathroom attached. But this room was so cold, and as we walked I felt someone tap on my hip. I jumped up and told them we had to go, that this was too much for me. They wanted to wait around a bit longer and begged me to stay. I was hesitant, but eventually I relented. I stayed with them. Suddenly, one of the bedroom doors slammed, and that was enough for all of us. We ran down the stairs, locking the door behind us. We sat down then, all of us quiet for a few minutes, when my coworker pulled out her phone and asked if we should listen to the recording to see if anyone, or anything, had answered. After a few deep breaths, we decided that we would listen. I wish I had just gone home. The first question she'd asked, "What is your name?" was answered with, "We don't." When asked, "How did you die?" we heard, "Madre," which is mother or mom in Spanish. One more question, and the answer broke our hearts. She'd asked, "How many are up here?" And the answer was, "Thousands." After that, she shut the recorder off. We all felt sick to our stomachs. We went home after that. That night I had trouble sleeping. After that night, work went on as usual. We still heard the tiny feet running around upstairs whenever it was quiet, and we even had the occasional customer ask us about the old brothel and if we'd ever experienced anything. I would tell them about the footsteps. I would even tell them a couple of us went upstairs, but I never go into full detail of what we heard. It's just too heartbreaking. I was there the rest of the summer and decided to go back to school after all. I go back there sometimes to see old friends and to eat, but I never want to go up to the brothel again. Babysitter's Horror Story from Cricket Girl 20. I worked as a babysitter when I was 15 for a family friend. I would watch the kids from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. There were 3 of them, aged 10, 6, and 3. Watching them was pretty easy, but the 10-year-old seemed a little distant. I thought it was because they didn't know me. One day after giving the kids some lunch, I was washing the dishes. I happened to look outside the window, and I saw this man standing in the yard, just staring at the house. I walked over to the front door and opened it, but the man was gone by then. The mom called me later and said that her aunt was in the hospital. She asked if I could stay the night with the kids, and I said yes. The family had 2 dogs, a beagle and a bulldog. That night, I was sleeping in the guest room with the dogs. They nudged me awake to take them outside, so I took them out to the front yard. While they sniffed around, I felt like I was being watched, but I couldn't see anything because it was so dark, and the front porch light didn't really cover the whole yard. After going back inside, I made sure to lock the door. I even double-checked it. About 2 hours after going back to bed, the 10-year-old kid came to the guest room, tapping me on the shoulder, and said, "There are noises outside my window." I asked, groggily, what these noises sounded like. They replied, "They sound like tapping." I got up to go check, but I didn't find anything outside the window. Still, I allowed the kid to sleep in the guest room with me. At about 4 a.m., the dogs started growling, and the 6-year-old came into my room with the 3-year-old. They said to me, "There's a man in the basement." I sat up quickly and asked, "What did you say?" They replied, "A man. He knocked on my window and said that he was a family friend and that Mom asked him to come check on us. But when I opened the door, he just walked right down to the basement." Before I could say anything, I heard footsteps walking into the kitchen. I locked the bedroom door, keeping the kids close to me, and I dialed 911. I whispered to the operator, "There's a man in the house I'm babysitting at. I don't know who he is." The operator told me to remain calm and to try to find a weapon. Luckily, the mom kept a baseball bat by her bed. I silently prayed. The kids were sobbing. The dogs were licking the tears from their faces. Suddenly, a loud bang came from out in the hall. The person kept banging until I heard a voice. "Get on the ground, now!" It was the police. Eventually, they came to the door and told me it was safe to come out. I opened up and saw who it was that had been banging on our door. It was the man who had been staring at the house earlier. Apparently, he was an ex-boyfriend of the woman who lived there before my friend and her kids moved in. He didn't know she'd moved and figured the kids were his ex's kids. After I told the mom, she apologized that I had to go through that and paid me more than she originally intended. I quit babysitting after that to help my mom after she got sick. This was one of the scariest experiences of my life. I keep in touch with the family. They're doing good these days. The mom is now married and has a baby with her new husband. I'm so grateful that the 6-year-old knew they made a mistake by letting the man in and got their baby sibling before coming to the guest room. It pains me to realize that night could have gone far, far worse. Yeah, I'm here. From Laurie Means Me. When the lights are out in a theater, it's dark. Darker than the back of your eyelids dark. This is why whenever a theater is closed, there is a single light, often a bare bulb on a rolling stand, left lit on the stage. This is the ghost light. Yes, it's helpful in keeping people from bumping into things or falling into the pit. However, the ghost light gets its name because it's also left out so that the spirits may put on their own productions whenever the theater is dark. Because every theater has its ghosts. The best known ghost at my junior college's main stage theater is Eleanor. Eleanor was even mentioned recently on the theater's social media pages. As the story goes, Eleanor used to be a stage manager at the theater, who one night tragically died in a car crash, either going to or from rehearsal. An ever-devoted stage manager, she came right back to the theater and hasn't left since. Eleanor does very noticeable but altogether harmless mischief around the theater, such as turning on work lights in the middle of blackouts, knocking about loudly in the shop, or rigging during quiet scenes. She might make equipment beep for no apparent reason, especially during quiet scenes, and hide things only to return them back to where you left them in the first place. Really, the scariest thing she does is sometimes moving the mannequin, usually into dark corners, to give us a good jump scare whenever we found it. Having done many shows in this theater, I have experienced all of these. However, Eleanor is harmless. She just seems to want to be acknowledged. The best way to keep her from pulling her pranks is to make sure you remember to say hello to her whenever you arrive, and good night whenever you leave. It's only polite. If you forget to greet her or doubt that she exists, she'll make sure you know of her presence. While Eleanor is the best known spirit in the main stage building, she's not the only haunt hanging around. There is another entity or two that lurk in the booth of that theater as well. No one knows who or what they are. Few know they're even there. But I know they're there. I know for a fact there is something in that booth. Now, for those who don't know, the booth is often a room in the theater where the tech crew runs the boards for lights and sound. Often a stage manager is up there as well to get the best view of the show, so that they may call cues. The booth is typically located at the back of the house, where the audience sits. The layout of the booth at my junior college is important for the story, so I'll give you a rough idea. It's a very long rectangular room at the back of the house. It runs along most of the length of this wall, a whole floor above the audience. The entire front of the booth is windows, so that the board operators can see the stage below. On the far left of the booth, when facing the stage, is the light board. Lining the stretch of windows are a few spotlights and chairs. To the far right of the room is a dividing wall. Its top half is a window, and it has a door with a smaller window in that. The smaller room is the sound booth. Due to this layout, it is impossible to see the soundboard operator while sitting at the light board, and vice versa. You must stand up and look over all the equipment to see the other station. There are only two ways in and out of that booth, the main one being a set of very steep, narrow, and rather echoey concrete stairs. Its entrance is in the house, and it ends up directly up top next to the light board. You really can't sneak up those stairs, even if you tried. They just echo too much. The second way is through the sound booth. It has a second door leading in from a platform outside of it. This is in a tall concrete room that leads to the sound cage below the booth, and has a door leading out into the house on the other side. This platform is like a tiny deck with nothing but a drop to the concrete floor below to catch your fall if you happened to step off. It has waist-high railings and a chain across an opening, as if it were the line for an amusement park ride. Next to the chained-off opening is a metal ladder anchored into the wall at a stiff 90 degrees. You gotta step out into the void to get onto it. Climbing up that ladder is the only other way into the booth. During shows, that ladder is in near complete darkness. I could normally hear the metal ring out with someone's steps climbing up, or see the spill from the flashlight. The point is, it's not easy to get into the booth quickly, quietly, or unnoticed. When I was the light board operator for one show run, it was after intermission that I climbed up the stairs into the booth, and I heard someone moving around in the sound booth. Of course, I figured it was the sound operator, Tony, so I called over. "Hey Tony, you up here?" I then heard him call back, loud and clear. "Yeah, I'm here." I sat down at my light board. "Awesome, we're gonna call places in a few minutes." I heard a bit of a grunt in reply. Not 2 moments later, I heard the door to the stairs open and some people coming up. I thought it might be our director, because he likes to come watch the shows from the booth sometimes. I look over my shoulder to say hi. Instead, my mouth drops open. It's not the director. It's another crew member, The sound operator, Tony. I looked at him, then looked at the sound room, then looked back at him. There's no way. I had just talked to Tony, right? What? His eyes followed mine to the sound booth. Getting up, I went over to the sound booth myself. Maybe someone else was in there. But no, I found it completely empty. I turned back to Tony, looking directly at him. I just asked if you were up in here. I heard you answer me. You said, "Yeah, I'm here." Tony and the other person who came up with him looked at me, shaking their heads. No? I was officially creeped out. You're not messing with me, are you? Because I swear, it was your voice. Tony shook his head again. You know I'm not going to climb down the ladder to run over here. It was true. We both avoided climbing the ladder if we didn't need to. And he hated running. He would not have had time to climb down and run over to the stairs either. I would have heard him go down the ladder. They would have told me by now if they were pranking me. And I would have found it funny if they had. But no, Tony had not pulled a prank on me. Instead, I just had a short conversation with whoever or whatever was in that booth. And when I asked, it told me very clearly. Yeah, I'm here. Crazy Eyes, from Admission Reserved. At the time, I had just been hired at a new job. I was set to start the following month in January. My new company invited me to their end-of-year retreat in Cape Town, South Africa. This happens every year, as head office is located there. This was something of a non-stop party week with continuous events. Since I was new, and I'd been flown down to the city, I wanted to make a good impression. Cape Town has beautiful beaches, hiking trails, great food, and trendy cafes. It's a tourist's dream. However, what people often fail to mention is the housing crisis and endemic substance abuse issues. This is the most expensive city in the country, and the gap between rich and poor is stark. Wealthy areas with homes with picturesque views of the sea are surrounded by makeshift shelters everywhere you look. It's not uncommon for you to be met by beggars outside your luxury Airbnb, asking for small change or food. On this particular day, my new department was going to have a picnic at the gorgeous botanical gardens. My new manager messaged me before, asking me to pick up some dessert from a store near where I was staying. This was mainly because I am a vegan, and they wanted to make sure I could partake in the festivities. I obliged and called an Uber. My driver dropped me off on Long Street, and I soon realized I was in the wrong place. For reference, Long Street is one of the main streets in the city. It always has a lot of people there. It's also well known for pickpockets and has degenerated over the years. I pulled out my phone and tried to look at Google Maps to see exactly where I was. Yes, I know this was a stupid idea, but I needed to know where I was and if I had to call another Uber. As I'm a woman barely over 5 feet with a small frame, I was an easy target. It was probably clear I was lost, too, as I looked around, confused. I started walking to the corner to get a better idea of where I was. Suddenly, a man started to approach me. At first, he was going a slow pace, then it turned into a straight-out run. This man was covered in dirt from head to toe and wore torn clothes. It was clear the man was homeless. The worst was that his pants were particularly tattered around his crotch, and I could see, well, everything in full view. I was shocked. There was no way he didn't know he was swinging all over the place. I felt sick, not only because I was being chased, but now I was being chased by a man with his junk on full display. But it wasn't his junk trying to say hello that was the most disturbing. It was his crazy eyes. His eyes were big, and his pupils dilated. He mumbled something inaudible, So there I was, lost in the city, a man chasing after me. Absolutely no idea where to go. I ran in no particular direction, and I kept checking behind me. Every time I did, it looked as though he was gaining on me. I could see those crazy eyes getting closer and closer. Before long, I was breathless. It felt as if I was moving in slow motion as the man steadily caught up to me. There were people around me, but they seemed not to be fazed by what was going on. The bystander effect is very real. Although, granted, if I'd been the one witnessing the event, I also don't know what I would have done. Suddenly, a security guard stepped out into the street, pulling me through a revolving door to a hotel lobby and locked it behind him. I thanked the guard while I was panting. All of a sudden, I hear a pounding at the door and this inaudible murmur. The man wildly banged at the door, and I wondered if it was going to break. The guard told me that I could stay as long as I needed. I was so grateful to her. Eventually, Crazy Eyes left. I waited another few minutes to make sure he was actually gone, and I then caught an Uber out of there. I phoned my new manager to let her know I could not get that dessert. It didn't even cross my mind that wasn't important anymore. Instead, I really needed a good cry, so I just sobbed into the phone. Later, when I went to the picnic, only with my story in hand, many others who lived in Cape Town said they knew exactly who I was talking about. Turns out Crazy Eyes was infamous and often paced the promenade. Everyone knew to stay out of his way. So if you ever find yourself in Cape Town, South Africa, remember to keep your eyes up, or you may find yourself looking at a three-eyed monster. Makeshift Medical Room. From I.M. I've worked as a paramedic for quite a while now, and believe me when I say that I've seen a lot of things on this job over the years. From minor headaches to freak accidents, from people overreacting to the mildest of injuries, to people outright refusing help while on the verge of death. I've seen some crazy stuff out there, or at least I thought I did, but nothing could prepare me for what happened to me on that cursed day. It was a hot summer afternoon. My partner and I were on our way to respond to a call in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The dispatcher had informed us that it was a routine medical call, possibly a case of heat exhaustion due to the scorching temperatures. We thought it would just be another day at the office, so to speak. As we pulled up to the address, we both immediately felt like something was not right. The house looked run down, like no one lived there for at least a couple of generations. Overgrown lawn, broken windows, paint almost completely peeled from the walls. It felt like we were stepping inside a haunted house from some horror movie. When we approached the front door, we were greeted by a tall, middle-aged man. When I saw him, my stomach turned upside down. Something was definitely wrong here. The man was so skinny, I could practically see his bones poking out. But that wasn't the only thing that was off about him. The man appeared distraught. His eyes were red from crying, but by far the most noticeable thing about him was the smell. He smelled like a mixture of roadkill, sweat, and feces. Judging by his smell and the state of his clothes, I assumed he hadn't showered in quite a while. He quickly ushered us into the house and kept repeating that his son needed help. When we finally got inside, it looked and smelled like we stumbled upon a crime scene. My partner and I were immediately hit with a strong metallic smell. Right away, we knew it was blood. The whole house reeked of it. The house was small with only a few rooms. From the few quick glances I took, I could see that the inside of the house looked even worse than it looked on the outside. The only things that were intact was a small chair and a wooden table. Everything else was either missing or broken. There were strange symbols and handwriting all over the walls. The man guided us to a room in the back of the house, still explaining that his son needed help. At that point, I was so creeped out, I wanted to turn tail and run. But I couldn't. The thought of someone needing my help kept me there and made me follow the man to that room. He opened the door, and what I saw almost made me pass out. In the middle of that dimly lit space, there was a makeshift medical room. It was filled with all sorts of bizarre equipment and tools, none of which seemed suitable for medical purposes. Next to them was a bed with a man strapped to it. His body was covered in strange markings and symbols, the same ones that were written on the walls. But that wasn't even the worst part of it. All over his body, there were small, messy cuts, probably made by one of those medical tools that were near him. He had a big, deep cut that was going from his stomach to his chest, like someone had been trying to open him up to reach his organs. My heart pounded in my chest as I took in the gruesome scene before me. My partner and I exchanged a glance that conveyed our mutual sense of unease and disbelief. We'd seen countless medical emergencies, but this was unlike anything we'd ever encountered. The man who had brought us here was still in a frantic state, babbling about how his son needed immediate help, how we had to help him. He kept repeating that they were inside, that we have to get them out. It was clear that he was deeply disturbed, but at that point, I stopped paying attention to him, and along with my partner, I ran out of the house. As we retreated from that nightmarish scene, my partner and I could not shake the feeling of dread that had settled into our guts. We dialed 911 urgently, requesting immediate police backup and additional medical personnel. This was far beyond the scope of a routine medical call. We needed help to handle this situation. While we waited for help to arrive, the man continued his frantic ramblings, shouting about them being inside and how we had to rescue his son. It was impossible to decipher his words through the panic and hysteria in his voice. He seemed to be in a state of delirium. My partner and I didn't want to be anywhere close to him. Within minutes, the police had arrived, followed closely by an ambulance with a team of paramedics. As we briefed those officers on the situation, they quickly apprehended the man and entered the house, cautiously, guns drawn. I could see on their faces that the bizarre symbols on the walls and the gruesome sight in the makeshift medical room had them on edge. After the police handcuffed the man, we rushed to assess the condition of the person strapped to the bed. He was unconscious and barely breathing. It was clear he was in critical condition and needed to be transported to a hospital as soon as possible. In the end, the man did pull through. He would have some scars, but other than that, no lasting injuries. At least, physical ones. I can't even imagine what that did to his mental state. Turns out, he wasn't even that lunatic's son. He was just a random person that man found on the street. The psychopath had drugged him and strapped him to that table. In the aftermath of that horrifying day, my partner and I could not help but reflect on the sheer madness of it all. The victim, now recovering in the hospital, had endured unimaginable torture at the hands of a complete stranger. It was a stark reminder to us both of the darkness that could hide within even the quietest neighborhoods. We later heard from the police that they launched an extensive investigation into the incident, trying to uncover the identity and motives of the deranged man who orchestrated that nightmare. The man who had led us to that house of horrors was deemed unfit for trial. He was placed in a psychiatric facility, where he would receive the treatment he so desperately needed. It was a relief to know he was no longer a threat to society, but the question of why he had committed such a heinous act lingered in the minds of everyone involved. Over the weeks that followed, the story garnered significant media attention, turning the suburban neighborhood into a hotbed of speculation and gossip. People couldn't believe that such a gruesome event had occurred in their midst. The shock waves of that day rippled through the community, leaving an ugly mark on its collective memory. I continued my work as a paramedic, but the haunted feeling from that cursed day never truly faded. It was something that truly tested my resolve and challenged my understanding of our world and the people that inhabit it. My partner, though, quit the job soon afterwards. Can't really blame him. It's not something that just disappears after you experience it. That kind of moment stays with you, deeply engraves itself into your mind until the day you die. It came with the fog. From Double D. 13 years ago, I was going through the worst period of my life. All possible misfortunes just followed one after the other. It all started when my husband left me for another woman and kicked me out of our home. Then I was one of the first to get fired when my company, where I spent over 10 years, ran into financial problems. When I thought that was the end of it, one night I fell asleep behind the wheel, ran off the road, and destroyed my already miserable car, the repairs of which I paid literally the last money I had. I ended up alone in a small, ugly apartment that I was renting, crying and feeling sorry for myself. Most of the people I considered friends turned their backs on me and left me alone at the mercy of my depression that had me tightly in its claws. My wake-up call was when I realized I would soon be homeless if I continued like this much longer. That's when I decided it was enough. I didn't need anyone, and I would get back on my feet. Since I'm a prisoner of a small, dying but once very lively mining town, I was in no position to choose the job I liked. I had to accept what was offered at the time. So I agreed to a new job at a nearby dairy farm. The job description was this: preparing and taking cows for milking and other related tasks. It's not something you fantasize about as a little girl, but when you're desperate and need money, unfulfilled childhood dreams are the least of your worries. Plus, the job wasn't bad at all. It just took a little bit of time to get used to the sounds, smells, and other charms a farm has to offer. One day, my boss gathered us all together, asking if any of us would be willing to work the night shift until he hired someone new for the job. Before he could even finish the question, I had my hand in the air. Changing to nights meant that I would get a better salary for way less work. Basically, all I would have to do is be physically present and make sure that everything was in order, that the cows were alive and undisturbed. If something really did happen, I could just call the boss. And if a pregnant cow went into labor, I could just call the vet. And that was that. Although the boss wasn't too thrilled with the idea since no one else came forward, he didn't have much choice. Honestly, the first few nights I wasn't comfortable being alone on that farm. But after I got over my fear, I started to really enjoy the place and the fresh night air. My boss planned my duties so that when I arrived, I would settle in a small, well, let's call it an office. And every once in a while, I would take a walk around the place to see if everything was okay. During one of those walks, a genius idea hit me, which I very quickly put into action. I made a small fortress out of hay bales, and instead of being in the office, I was chilling in my new spot. Most of the time, I would read books with a small headlamp, and the best part was that I didn't have to walk anymore, because in case something happened, I would hear everything from my little fortress. One night, just as I was starting a new book, footsteps began to echo in the dead silence of the farm. Loud, specific footsteps that I knew immediately where they were coming from. In front of one of the barns was a large patch of dirt, and at the moment there was a bunch of mud there. The kind of mud that would torture you fairly well before letting you go through it. I could hear a splash, splash. There was no doubt someone was in front of the barn. I wasn't really scared. I expected to find someone from a nearby town trying to steal some oil from one of the mini machines, and I would just tell them to go away before calling the police. It was only when I peeked out from my fortress when I noticed a thick fog had begun to cover every corner of the farm. I bravely started making my way towards the unknown intruder, but to my surprise, there was no one there. It wasn't possible for someone to run away that quickly. As I said, that thick mud does not let go easily. I should have either found someone there, or at least heard them desperately attempting to get out of the mud. Confused and slightly doubting my own ears, I went back to my position and listened carefully. All I heard was silence. I decided to call my brother, because at the time he was in the phase of hardcore gaming and I knew he'd be awake still. I needed to hear a familiar voice. I needed a logical explanation to calm me down a bit. Of course, he told me it was probably nothing, that I was just tired and that my brain was playing tricks on me. He said if someone was really there by now, I would have heard something else. Fully relieved by my brother's words, I went back to my book. I don't know exactly how much time passed, but judging by the pages I read, I would say at least an hour or two, when the silence was disturbed once more. This time, not by footsteps echoing through the farm, but rather a totally unknown, eerie, and somewhat irritating sound that I would best describe as gargling and slurping, somehow at the same time. I didn't dare to move, as the sound was coming closer and closer, then stopped right in front of my little fortress. I stayed there like a statue, my heart in my throat, and a disgusting bitter taste filling my mouth. I had absolutely no idea what to do. Yeah, I guess you're right. Maybe we can hang out tomorrow. Well, then give me a call when you wake up. I love you. Those were the words that woke me up from my trance. Those were my words. That was my voice. Because that's exactly what I'd said to my brother on the phone earlier. When it finally hit me that the footsteps I heard were in fact real, that they belonged to this whatever the thing was, that all this time I'd been convincing myself I was alone on the farm, this thing was hidden somewhere nearby, and that it was now speaking to me in my voice, and the only thing standing between us was a single bale of hay, I jumped out of my fortress like a bullet and ran into the night, praying to God that I didn't get lost while trying to find my car in the thickest fog I've ever seen. It didn't take me too long to find the car. When I made it, I just sat down, locked myself in, and desperately tried to put the key in the ignition with trembling hands. I then felt and heard something brush against the car. I managed to start the car, and more than anything I wanted to press in the gas, but because of the darned fog, I was forced to move at a crawling pace, and the entire time I could feel light pushes and hear tapping on the back window of the car. I'm not sure when it all stopped, because I was crying and sobbing so loud it was all I could hear at that point. When I felt I'd driven far enough, I called my boss and I tried to explain what happened. But I don't think I managed to say a single word that made sense, and he had no idea what happened or what I was even talking about. But by then I didn't care. I just wanted to go home and hide under a blanket. In the morning when I heard my phone ring, I immediately knew it was my boss calling, that he would want to see me, and that I would likely get fired. But first I would be forced to listen to his speech about how I shouldn't have pushed myself for a job that I wasn't ready to do. But I was wrong. He wasn't mad at all. and I soon found out that the horror story didn't end with me running away from the farm. After my crazy call, my boss came to the farm and tried to find out what had happened. However, due to the thick fog, the only thing he could do was go around the barns. And one of them, he found a dead cow. At first glance, nothing strange. It happens, unfortunately. Except this was one of the pregnant cows, and her belly had been ripped open, the abdominal cavity completely empty. No calf, not a single organ, not a drop of blood, a stain, a print, no sign of a struggle. Nothing. Just a dead animal, surrounded by dozens of other cows that were now calmly munching on hay and didn't seem the least bit upset. How is it possible to walk among so many animals, tear open one's belly, take out so much content in total silence, then walk away without leaving any trace? Although I was returned back to my milking job, my financial situation was still bad, so I didn't last long there. I've never believed in the paranormal before. I've never been a person that gets easily scared. But that night changed everything for me. I didn't feel comfortable working when I knew that maybe I was being watched by something that was just waiting for the right moment to grab me. Then, instead of a cow, I would be left dead, found with a torn open belly, completely empty on the cold, dirty floor. Tales from the Break Room is a viewer-submitted podcast featuring allegedly true scary stories that happened on the way to, on the way from, or at work. If you want your story to be narrated on the show, send it to us at eeriecast.com/submit. As of April 14th, we're paying 3 cents per word for stories that are approved and make it onto the show. Submission does not guarantee approval or payment. For a limited time only, PayPal only. Tales from the Break Room is an EerieCast Network original podcast hosted by Darkness Prevails. You can follow him on Twitter at Dark Prevails, and you can hear thousands more stories read by him on our other show, Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also enjoy plenty more horror-themed podcasts at EerieCast.com.